Welcome. I am Carol Lee, founder and CEO of WHAM, Women's Health Access Matters. And on behalf of WHAM and our partners, the American Heart Association and Northwell Health's Katz Institute for Women's Health, thank you so much for joining us today for what promises to be a fascinating discussion with the foremost leaders in women's heart health. June 2023 will mark the 30th anniversary of the NIH Revitalization Act of 1993. That was a regulation that women and minorities be included in all clinical trials and research funded by the NIH. At that time, it took a very committed group of bipartisan legislators who collaborated with many different constituents, including patients, providers, advocates, and policymakers, to develop and approve this momentous event. But we still have a very long way to go. And WHAM is determined to build a new dialogue and platform to shift the imbalances which still exist today. Even though some progress has been made, accelerating women's health research and investment is an economic imperative that offers tremendous returns for very small investments. Joining me today are exceptional leaders in their fields: Dr. Jen Hall, Chief Data Science of American Heart Association; Dr. Kathy Magliato, the founder, CEO, and Chief Medical Officer of Cordex Systems and one of the few female cardiothoracic surgeons in the world; Dr. Stacy Rosen, Senior Vice President of Women's Health, Katz Institute for Women's Health at Northwell Health; and Dr. Nanette Wenger, the Director of Cardiac Clinics at Grady Health and Professor of Medicine, Division of Cardiology at Emory University School of Medicine. I am so grateful that you could all join me today in this dialogue, which will be followed by audience Q&A. So please post your questions in the Q&A section below, and we'll do our best to answer them. So let's begin with a very brief history of women's health over the last 30 years. I know that's hard to do, but the status of where we started 30 years ago and where we are today. And then we'll talk about where we need to be in the next 3 years, not 30. So let me start by introducing Dr. Nanette Wenger, who in 1993 shook the medical community with her seminal paper highlighting the striking differences in women's heart disease risks, prognosis, treatment, and outcomes. Nearly 30 years later, heart disease is still the #1 killer of women. And I want you to all think about how revolutionary and bold it was for her to ask in 1993, does sex matter? And the answer, it turns out, of course, was yes. And that changed science and showed how heart disease was different in women, and of course has saved thousands of lives. Nanette, you are amazing. And for all the work that you are still doing, including, I know we grabbed you away from a day-and-a-half program at the University of Miami where you were the guest lecturer. You've never stopped fighting for women's health, and yet 30 years later, we still have some of the same challenges. I wonder if you could give us a brief history of how your seminal research was received, what followed to help shift the greater awareness of heart disease in women, and where are we today?
As I saw patients in the clinic and on the wards, I realized that there was no information available, and women were being, as they are today, under-recognized, underdiagnosed, undertreated, and overrepresented in the adverse outcomes. So that what we had to do was to inform the community. And working with the National Institutes of Health, we had first a workshop and then a conference. And of course, the paper on women and coronary heart disease, published in the prestigious New England Journal, they tell me was the first time the term women and coronary disease was put to the scientific community in a major medical journal. Now, what this did, I expect, was enroll a number of people in my vision, because we identified the knowledge gaps, and knowledge gaps require research. But what has happened is that really since the year 2000, as we have done the research, we have seen the mortality drop from cardiovascular disease in women so that it is now lower than that in men. And as I've said in many platforms, we are delighted to be in second place and we want to stay there. Now, remember, as I've said for many times, that as we address women's heart health, there are 4 stages. The first is investigate, get the research data. The second is educate. Educate women and educate their healthcare providers. The third is advocate, as we are doing today and do every day. And the last is legislate. And now we are talking about the legislate, because we are 30 years out from a momentous piece of legislation. But remember, this is directed only to government-funded research, rather than the research that is done by other sectors of the economy. And what that did was to recommend that women and other minority groups, women are not a minority, we're more than half. So let's look at women as the minority, but other groups be included in clinical trials. But remember, and probably the reason for that 30 years is that it was a recommendation. Even though it wasn't a piece of legislation, there was not a mandate. And the mandate did not come until 2015, the Research for All Act, which mandated by the Government Accountability Office that women be included in clinical trials and that the data be disaggregated as they were presented. It also gave some information for the basic scientists, and it required that the basic scientists know the provenance of their cells and tissues, etc. Can you imagine that women's health research might have been done on male tissues and male animals? No more. 2015 ended that. So we really are making a leap now at 2015 and saying, what is there that we can do? We have the luxury of having now 20 years of physicians and heart health scientists being educated in the fact that women are not just small men, and that there is a difference in the biology, in the pathophysiology, in the diagnostic tests, in the pharmacotherapy, and in the outcomes for women. But we've just begun to scratch the surface. There are so many areas that we must explore. We must address prevention of heart disease for women of all ages. We must address the disparities among populations of women, because we know that the most vulnerable among the women are the younger women who don't have the heart health messages, are the women of racial and ethnic minorities. So we have to do both basic science and clinical science and translational and public health and policy research. And it is this research that will drive the improved cardiovascular health for women. The advantage is that we have educated both the men and women who are the healthcare providers, and we are trying as hard as we can to educate women. You know, about 2004, there were campaigns by the Heart Association, the Red Dress campaign, to tell women that the female heart was vulnerable to heart disease. And we educated from 30% to 56% of the population. That still meant that almost half of the women didn't realize it. And when we surveyed the women back in 2019, we found that we had lost ground, that 75% of the women were unaware of the signs and symptoms of heart attack. And we now have to start educating women, but we need the research to improve the diagnostics and the care for women and to improve their clinical outcomes.
Well, thank you very much for that, Nanette. We'll come back. You're sharing how women's heart health has evolved over the past 30 years sets the stage for us to now ask Dr. Stacy Rosen, who is a practicing cardiologist and senior vice president at Northwell Health's Katz Institute for Women's Health, which specializes obviously in all aspects of women's health, as well as Stacy is a member of WHAM's collaborative. And in addition to that, she's produced a movie, Misdiagnosed, highlighting some of the health inequities, which Nanette, you pointed out. And we'll come back. I have so many questions to ask you, but Stacy, perhaps you can share with us, how has the practice of cardiology shifted over the years to improve the diagnosis, treatment, and outcomes of women's heart disease. And Nanette pointed to the fact that there isn't enough research, which we're very aware of. As many of you know, in WHAM's study with the RAND Corporation, what we learned was that only 4.5% of the NIH research focuses on women's heart disease. So what hasn't changed quickly enough for you? And how did the passing of that act affect the teaching, the training, the practice of heart health in women? And I'll just ask those two questions to get you started.
Oh, thank you. And we were privileged enough to interview Dr. Wenger for our documentary. So I graduated medical school in 1985, and that was truly the year that the mortality curves, the American Heart Association puts out statistics on heart disease and stroke annually. And in 1985, the curves crossed for mortality rates between men and women. And so I started my career seeing an upstroke in death from heart disease in women in a condition that I was trained or originally taught is a man's illness. And yet we saw for the next 15 to 20 years an increase in death and disability for women, simultaneous with a precipitous drop in death and disability from heart disease and stroke in men. And the delta, the difference in the mortalities between the sex and gender, got worse and worse over a time period. And it was clear to us that our premise, our male model, our bikini approach was clearly wrong. And then when you looked at what we needed to do differently, it was a multi-pronged approach. As Dr. Wenger aptly put, the research had to be there. If we were studying only men and male animals and cells, we were clearly missing something. Sex as a biologic variable was something that we weren't talking about decades ago, but it clearly became an important part of our opportunities to change. Women didn't know, as Nanette aptly pointed out, what their biggest risk was. And one of the most frightening things is the 2019 report that not only have we gone backwards in the number of women that know that heart disease is their number one killer, and that's right, 56% was never a particularly good number. But when you look at that data for Black women versus non-Hispanic whites and Hispanic women, it's even more abysmal. So advocacy and awareness, the Heart Association and so many of us, NHLBI, partnered with media. We discovered that women got their information not from their clinicians, not from the scientific journals, but from women's magazines and webinars, or what are now webinars. And so this partnership to raise awareness, raise advocacy, almost an empowerment, what was critical. Policy was important. Changes in how testing and evaluation is done. Historically, women should not be having the same cardiovascular testing as men for certain conditions. Yet there was an under-reimbursement in the clinical world for some of these, and almost a disincentive to have this, what we now call a sex and gender informed approach to how we do it. These are the ways that things got better. And we saw that in the precipitous drop in women dying from heart disease and stroke. But we still have much, much more to do. We've aptly realized that health inequities and social determinants of health cause this to be a disproportionate problem in certain communities. And as clinicians and advocates and scientists, we can no longer stay in our lane of what we consider our job as doctors and scientists, but instead we need to address housing inequities, food deserts, access, language problems, language challenges, educational challenges. And I'm very proud that the cardiology world has really taken on the totality of how we manage and improve women's heart health. And in my day job, overseeing initiatives focused on women outside of the Department of Cardiology, I think the heart story is the classic explanation to everyone what we mean by women's health, as Dr. Wenger says, beyond the bikini approach, because the story and the needs have changed for improving the outcomes of heart disease for women, heart health for women. It is the same with lung conditions and orthopedic and rheumatology and cancers. And so the arguments that we have so aptly try to get the word out that women's health is a bigger issue, and that we need to look at research and require it and report it differently. We need to advocate. We need to have policy. We need to partner with tech and finance and the traditional academic institutions. And honestly, the health of women will be improved if we take the lessons we learned from the cardiovascular world and generalize them, quite honestly.
So, Stacey, what has not changed during your career that you would like to see change?
Yeah, I still feel it's one of those instances where we know what to do, yet we often still feel that we're pushing boulders up hills, and then they come down, and the boulder image also comes from Nanette, and that we are still needing to argue the value of doing sex and gender informed science, of valuing the fact that from a societal point of view, improving the health of women has a far bigger impact on our communities and our environments. And I think the fact that this hasn't become foundational still in the research communities, in the clinical communities, we're not training our medical students and our nursing students in sex and gender focus. So then we are just going to continue to perpetuate the challenges that we've had for 100 years. I could go on. There is far too much that hasn't changed, Carolee.
Well, as we both know, but I think I'm trying to clarify and identify how we can zero in on the areas that perhaps are in the greatest need of change or would affect the greatest numbers of people. Nanette, I'd love to come back and just ask you the question, how your report, did it have an impact on the teaching, the training, the practice of heart health? And if so, what was that difference? And what have you seen in terms of the difference over the years?
Well, I expect it was really an information that the female heart is vulnerable to disease. And that was a game changer, and it was a paradigm changer. And I expect that realizing the vulnerability was the one that sparked, how do we identify the women who are at risk? How do we mitigate that risk? How is the best way to identify and test women? What are the best therapies to alter their care? But over the years, what has happened is we've seen some change in the demography that really worries me, because we always thought that heart disease was a disease of old women. It was an old lady's disease. And now we're realizing that among our most vulnerable population are the young women. And we found from research studies that the young women who have heart attacks do far worse than the young men, that their risk factors are very different. We've come to identify that there are a number of risk attributes for women that are female specific, and we must get those incorporated in our risk scores. We have to realize that the young women who come to pregnancy with poor heart health, and that is contributing substantial to maternal mortality. And we've come to realize that assessing pregnancy complications is routine to assess women's risk, because the complications of pregnancy are the markers of future cardiovascular disease. And that disease occurs 2 to 5 years after, for example, a pregnancy with preeclampsia. It occurs while women are still in their reproductive years. So we have to tell women that women in their reproductive years are at risk, particularly if they've had complications of pregnancy. And at our Emory Women's Heart Center, we have a cardiologist in the preeclampsia clinic meeting these women where they are and teaching them about heart health and the fact that not only is their heart health impacted by the complications of pregnancy, but their offspring, their children, are at increased risk. So we have to get women healthy coming to a pregnancy. We now have new guidelines for treating to lower levels hypertension in pregnancy, for therapies that can prevent or decrease preeclampsia. But now we have to watch the woman after she has delivered, and as she takes care of her child, and as she brings the child to the pediatrician saying, I've had a complication of pregnancy, my child may be at increased risk. So we now have the pediatricians enrolled in our sphere.
Yeah, I wanted you to give that broader explanation, which I greatly appreciate. I know many others do as well. Thank you for that. I'm going to come back with a couple of other questions I have. But I'd now like to introduce another great partner to WHAM, Dr. Jennifer Hall, who is Chief of Data Science at the American Heart Association and the leading expert at the intersection of health technology and science. And I can't think of a more dynamic, exciting place to be right now, Jen. How, in your perspective, has the AHA changed over the years in identifying and addressing the unique needs of women in heart disease, as has just been so clearly shared by Stacy and Nanette? Can you take that on?
I think I can. So first of all, it's just great to hear, Nanette. I think I don't know if you know, I'm sure you do, but what you laid out, research, education, advocacy, and legislature is real. The acronym, right? So keep it real. I just think it's awesome. So I'm going to remember that now. So as I always try to remember what you say, but the AHA is funding more research that is aimed at exactly the issues you were both talking about, Nanette and Stacy, that is women with hypertension that are in their reproductive years, and, trying to tease out the biological versus the social and structural determinants of health that are sort of the foundation of the issue. And so we're doing some more work in that area. I think the other technical issues that the AHA is, technology-wise, that we're beginning to move is in the area of telehealth. And Nanette's super excited to hear about what Emory is doing around connecting those OBGYN clinics with the cardiologists, and those places that perhaps don't have that ability in rural America or other areas across the United States could go with a telehealth program where they can bring in a cardiologist through telehealth and make those connections for women and families that might not have those resources. So AHA is really beginning to double down in those areas and help people in that area, as well as bring them more data. And so we have our registry data called Get With the Guidelines, which has 13 million patient records there that are de-identified, which we open up for research now. And that brings a lot of women and more data on women into the fold, from heart failure, stroke, atrial fibrillation, coronary artery disease, that we open up and make available in a technology platform we call the Precision Medicine Platform, that allows researchers and early trainees to look at that data and publish new findings with different technologies like deep learning and artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so those are just some of the ways that the American Heart Association is beginning to, I would say, dig down a little bit into some new ways that we can find some answers for women.
Yeah, I would think you're at a real nexus point of data analytics, including AI, I'm sure, is having a tremendous impact on what you're doing. And I'm assuming that this will all contribute to better diagnosis, treatments, and outcomes for women. Is it overwhelming with the amount of data that you have, or is it now so exciting for you because you can obviously take that data and direct it in ways that are emphatically effective?
It's really exciting because we have so many great individual researchers out there across the world that can really begin to dive into this data now that it's open. And
Yeah.
so by breaking down those silos where, when I, was a fellow and training, everybody kept their data to themselves. It wasn't the norm to share your data. And now it is beginning to turn over and say that we really want transparency. We want to share data. And that's opening a lot of new discoveries for women because the cohorts are larger, even for genetics and stroke, genetics and migraine, genetics and heart failure. You have cohorts that can come together now and create 500,000 individuals versus 1,000, 2,000. And that's the same for ethnicities and different races where we just didn't have the numbers before. And now with technology and data sharing, that is available to researchers to really make some movements in the field.
What's your biggest challenge?
I think one of the biggest challenges now is to think if we had a big staunch of funding, where would you put it to make the greatest discovery in the, where is it close? And if you put that money in, where would you get an answer? Because with science, there's never any guarantee, but you want to push the needle, right? And I think that's some of the biggest, those are good challenges to have, of course.
Totally. Well, one of the things that surprised us, as I mentioned earlier, when we did the WHAM report, was that only 4.5% of the NIH budget was allocated to studying women and heart disease, yet women's heart disease is the #1 killer. So I find it curious that of all of our numbers, that was the smallest number. Alzheimer's was 12%, autoimmune disease was 7%. And the fact that heart disease was 4.5% just absolutely blew my mind. I'll come back to that as well in a minute. But thank you, Jen, always for your friendship and for your support of WHAM. I'd now like to introduce Kathy Magliotto, who's one of the few female heart surgeons in the world, as well as the founder and CEO and chief medical officer of Cordex Systems, a medical device company that's developing a diagnostic cardiac technology that assesses changes in vascular health. And we decided in this roundtable, which is the second of a series that we're hosting, to bring in the idea that we need to be developing more diagnostic tools as well as other modalities to help create change. So we need to push the needle on research for sure. We need to double that number, which is what the WHAM report found, from 4.5 or $20 million, which is for me just so insignificant to what it needs to be. And we also need to invest in women-owned, women-founded, women-run companies. And I think most of you probably listening to this are aware of the fact that less than 2% of VC money goes to women and less than 1% in biopharma. Where 52% of the population, 50% of the workforce own 60% of the wealth in the country, responsible for 85% of the spending, and we're the chief medical officers of our families making 80% of the healthcare decisions. It is not acceptable to me that that number of 2% or 1% exists. And that was one of the reasons for wanting Kathy to speak, not only as obviously a phenomenal physician and cardiothoracic surgeon, but also as an inventor, if you will, as someone who has taken an innovator, has taken an idea and is building a company. So Kathy, a couple of questions. First of all, I'd love to hear how you became a cardiothoracic surgeon, what possessed you to go down that path. And then, of course, I'd love to see the connection between being that level of a physician and seeing a need that you're trying to fill and change.
Thanks, Carolee. And I want to just point out to my friend Jennifer at AHA that I'm wearing red today, Jen, for Women's Heart Health Month, right? So everybody put away your pink for Breast Health Month, which was October. and embrace Women's Heart Health Month. So happy Heart Health Month to everybody who's joined today. Thanks so much for that intro, Carolee. I completely hear you about funding. As you know, I'm in a capital round right now, raising a Series A, $10 million Series A, and you're right. It's basically pushing a rock up a hill every day, which I happen to love to do as an entrepreneur. But as you mentioned, I am a cardiothoracic surgeon. It's pretty rare to be a female heart surgeon, though I guess, Dr. Wenger, you've got a couple at Emory, so that's fantastic. It's so rare, in fact, that about less than 4% or so of heart surgeons are women, and as you pointed out, Carolee, it's even more rare to be the founder and CEO of a medical technology startup company. That's around 2.7% women. So I've decided that anything 3% or less, and I'm doing it. So next week I'm going to be an astronaut or a Kardashian, and honestly could go either way. So we'll see. In addition, as you know, I'm an author. I wrote a book about heart disease in women that was autobiographical and got picked up and became a television show on NBC, though it was loosely based on my life. So if anyone's seen the show Heartbeat, I just want you to know that, number one, I'm not in a love triangle, though I kind of wish I was. And number two, I don't have a gay ex-husband, though, gosh, I really wish I did. And so additionally, I'm the past president of the American Heart Association for the Western State Board, and I'm a spokesperson for the AHA. And so, you asked me, why did I become a heart surgeon in the midst of all of this? And for me, I guess the short answer is because the more they told me I couldn't do it, the more I wanted to do it. And that's sort of my stubborn Italian background. But for me, honestly, it was a love at first sight. The first time I ever saw the human heart, the first time I ever touched the human heart, I thought, oh my God, what an incredible honor and privilege. And I was an intern in surgery at the time, and I got thrown into an operating room where a heart surgeon said, hey, can you, put on some gloves and get up here to the table and hold the heart steady while I put some stitches in. And again, the minute I touched that heart, I thought, wham, this is exactly what I want to do, because the heart has an incredible beauty in its singularity and its function. I could shish kebab one of your lungs or drill a hole through a kidney, and honestly, you've got another one as a backup. But the human heart, you only get the one. And in terms of function, I'm just humbled by the fact that this organ sits in our chest. We take advantage of it, not really knowing how hard it works. It beats about 100,000 times a day, and in your lifetime, it'll beat 2.5 billion times. And it'll actually push enough blood through your body, about 2,000 gallons a day, to fill 200 super tankers of a train car. So again, hardest working organ in the human body, if you ask me, and it's why I became a heart surgeon. Many of you may not know this, but when we do heart transplants, and I'm actually a heart transplant surgeon, so sadly, I'm the doctor you get to see when your heart is decimated by heart disease and you need a new one. But when we remove that old heart from your chest, that weak, tired, sick heart, I don't know if you know this, but it continues to beat outside your chest. We put it on the table, and it just continues to beat. And what's incredible is it doesn't know it's left your body. All it knows is to do its job. And so I just have so much respect for that organ that, to me, there was no other pathway. You asked me, what frustrates me or what I find to be the biggest challenge in heart disease. And honestly, hands down, it's the fact that I am operating on a disease that's 80% preventable. The fact that 30 years later, we're still talking about heart disease being our #1 killer, heart disease killing more women than all cancer combined. That's not okay with me. That is not okay. It shouldn't be okay with any of us, right? But that challenge of dealing with a disease that's preventable is pretty horrific on an OR table, especially as, again, Dr. Wenger, you point out about young women. You know, we're operating on 30, 40-year-old women with children. I mean, this is crazy with heart disease. And so I figured out pretty quickly that I wasn't going to solve this problem around preventing heart disease in women from an OR table, which gets me to the last question you asked about the innovation I'm developing. And so I went back to school, got an MBA. I was pregnant, by the way, went back to school, got an MBA while pregnant. And there I met a really amazing gentleman, Dr. Michael Witt, a PhD bioengineer, who was also getting his MBA at UCLA Anderson School of Business. And Michael comes up to me the very first day of class and he says, "Oh my gosh, you're a heart surgeon? I'm a bioengineer and I have this incredible idea." His incredible idea was his PhD dissertation. And what his idea was to take the most commonly used tool in medicine, a tool that we've had, by the way, since 1881, which is an ordinary blood pressure cuff, and using a proprietary mathematical algorithm, turn an ordinary blood pressure cuff into a technology that can non-invasively, in about 6 minutes, measure the earliest warning sign of the development of heart disease, which is hardening of your arteries. Remember, we used to call heart disease hardening of the arteries. A stiffening of your arteries turns out to be the precursor to you developing plaque down the line, right? And so, you know, what you ask yourself, well, why would a measurement of vascular health like this be important? So sorry, Carolee, I'm gonna pick on you for just a minute. And sadly, I'm going to give you cancer. Okay, I'm going to give you, you know, one of the most common solid organ tumors, especially that I deal with, which is lung cancer. And let's just say that Carolee has lung cancer, right? So if you have lung cancer, we're going to treat you with chemotherapy, right? And we're going to do serial CAT scans to watch that tumor shrink in response to therapy. And Carolee, you're going to live or die based on whether that disease shrinks, based on whether that tumor shrinks. But here's the dirty, ugly truth about heart disease, not just for women, but for everyone. We aren't actually tracking whether your heart disease shrinks in response to treatment. So we give you medications to treat your cholesterol and your blood pressure and your blood sugar. We ask you to lose weight, quit smoking, decrease your stress, exercise, eat right. But at no point in time are we watching whether any of these things are improving your blood vessel health. That's what this technology can do. That's what's so groundbreaking and game-changing and disruptive. It's a very simple tool based on the platform of an automated blood pressure cuff that can track changes in your blood vessel stiffness, your vascular health, as you engage in all these preventative measures for a disease that's 80% preventable. And that's why I'm so excited to have developed this company. And, you know, again, we built this company from nothing. We literally took Michael's PhD dissertation, embodied that into prototypes, started testing patients. We've tested to date now over 700 patients, and we're taking the technology through the FDA approval process, which is why I mentioned that I was raising this round of capital. So hopefully someone out there wants to fund women and put their money where their mouth is to prevent a disease that's 80% preventable. And with that, I'll pause there. Carolee, you've been cured of cancer, by the way. So if you have any questions.
Thank you.
Woo, you made it. You made it, honey. You made it.
Thank you. Yeah. The curious thing, first of all, that was fantastic. Thank you for the energy and the enthusiasm and the explanation and the passion around the human heart. I can only imagine. And it's extraordinary what you've done. So congratulations. And I'm really delighted to have featured this aspect of investing, which I think is so important for women to be thinking about in each other and in modalities that in fact will be able to create change, just like research will. So I'll come back. I've got so many questions for everyone, but I think, as you might have heard me say on our last call and also earlier today, you know, to support some of the ideas that we're talking about, we're launching a wonderful social media campaign called #3not30. And we're going to be focusing on this during the year because really what we want to be is a motivator and a driver and an engine that says change has to take place. This is a group of women that's created significant change. I stand on their shoulders, and I would like to see us all collaborate with other members of the ecosystem, whether that's pharma business, policy advocacy. It's a little bit of everything, as Nanette pointed to. It's many different parts of society that can create change. And as women drive economies, I think that change has to take place also from all of us. And I think we're going to have to be the drivers of that. And so 3 Not 30 was really developed to focus on the idea of what can we change in 3? None of us are waiting another 30. Yeah. And so with that, I'd like to just toss it to each of my incredible panelists to say, Nanette, you've had an incredible career, and you're beyond the fairy godmother of heart disease. You're the voice, you're the platform, you're the framework. You're the first one to really shout about this from the rooftops. Here you have an opportunity. Tell us what we can change in 3 years, not 30.
I think we have to realize that heart disease is not solely a medical problem, that what we have to do is to address beliefs, we have to address public policy, we have to address cultural differences, we have to address social determinants of health, we have to meet our patients where they are, or our potential patients where they are. So, you know, one of the things that was done in groups of men that I found very exciting is that for the control of blood pressure in Black men, they put a pharmacist in the Black barbershops, and that increased the use of medications and the control of blood pressure. Why are we not in the nail salons and the hair salons to teach women about their heart health? Why are we not on social media to tell women that, as was pointed out, 80 to 90% of this heart disease is preventable? Some of the complications of pregnancy may be preventable among young women. We have to get to the social media to do that. But remember that so much research is being done by the entrepreneurs, as we just heard, and the entrepreneurs go to the FDA. And you know what happens when you go to the FDA as a company, you say, well, I have this. If I do this in this study and these are the results, is it likely that my drug or device will be approved? And the FDA gives advice and says, well, perhaps you should be sure that there's some women that are being tested, but there are no teeth in that advice. And what we need for the industry realm is to say, the drug or the device is fine for that population on which it's been tested. If you haven't tested this in elderly patients, well, why should we assume that it will work? If you haven't tested it in women, why should we assume that it will work? And I expect that as we look at more regulation, this is one of the areas where I'd like to see some legislation that would apply to our wonderful entrepreneurs, that would make them look at 52% of the population, and that's the women, as they develop their new drugs and devices.
Yeah.
Terrific.
I love that, Nanette, and I know I shared my data with you with the group at WHAM, but more than 50% of the people that we've tested with our technology are women, so I hear you. But it takes an effort. Yeah, it takes an effort to do that. We actually have more women tested than men.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Jen, I'm going to toss it to you.
Yeah, I'm gonna go a little bit askew of where I would normally with data, but say, you know, I've just heard about a new model that NIH is doing that I'm very excited about, and that is that for preclinical studies, that, you know, before, like in my time, they would do an N of 10, an N of 15, and then they would test, you know, these drugs in preclinical trials, and that's where they would get their data. But now they're making it much more rigorous and setting up networks and sort of these new centers where they take a much more rigorous statistical approach, and they include, different, female mice or female rats or different preclinical models, and include half at least of female preclinical models in that. And that, again, is a different model that we need to start embracing in research, not just for women, but overall, just really changing the way we think about, we have the ability to do these things now. Why aren't we changing them?
Great question. Yeah. Stacy?
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm going to second what both Jen and Nanette has said, and add my thoughts for 30 is going upstream a bit. And firstly, I think that should be an impact on education. There are only 155 allopathic medical schools in the United States. They are regulated by a government organization. Many, as Nanette can attest to, I can attest to at ours, are undergoing curricular redevelopments. We're no longer having medical students sit in classrooms for the first 2 years. So I think going upstream for how we educate the next generation of clinicians and scientists to see the importance, again, of a sex and gender informed education, so that the question of how does this affect women, how does this affect Black women, potentially different than non-Hispanic white women, so that it really becomes foundational to the way the next generations of clinicians and scientists are trained. And I would extrapolate that to nursing schools and PhD programs in the sciences, so that we sort of put a stop to the way all of us were trained. Medical schools then go to postgraduate. We've got a robust women's heart program here at Northwell, but I think that the requirements of our medical students and fellows to rotate through, the way they rotate through other parts, is not there. Secondly, with going upstream, I think every physician, and this was alluded to when Nanette described their cardio obstetrics program, young women, their only physician is a gynecologist. And so the opportunity to impact and share the information so that a GYN visit on a 22-year-old includes questions about family history, modifiable risk factors, stress, sleep, food choices, all of the other things, because we know that atherosclerosis starts in these young women. And then the partnership with adverse pregnancy outcomes and the impact. So the tagline I've heard sometimes is the heart is a lady part. So bringing that upstream to our gynecologists, to partnerships with OBGYN. And then my second, as Nanette alluded to, is the power of the patient and going where they live, whether it's community groups, faith-based, sororities, so that this really becomes a respectful and, we know, successful way to move the needle. And finally, to Jen's point, I think implementation science is key. When you look at the percentage of women in the US who are hypertensive, it's bad enough. But then when you look at the percentage of women who have controlled hypertension, it's an abomination. And it's certainly an opportunity for us to ask the question, why is that? And study that in a way that can have a meaningful and long-lasting impact. But it starts with 3.
Well, thank you. No, thank you for that. I'm going to read you a couple of questions, and whoever wants to jump in, please do. Despite the breadth of data captured by Get With The Guidelines, why is it out-of-hospital cardiac arrest neglected? And especially when it's such a major public health burden?
I can take that. I responded to that and told them that they could follow up with me offline, Carol Lee, and I would give them a full answer to that, because it takes a little more time than we probably have here to address that fully.
Okay. Well, thank you for that.
Sure.
And then the other is,
Carol Lee, can I chime in real quick?
Yeah, please.
So
please.
I didn't get to answer your 3 out of 30, but it actually tangentially has something to do with that question. And, you'd asked everybody, what would you want to see in 3 years? So of course, I'm going to swing for the fences, right? And the reason why swinging for the fences in 3 years is important is because we're dealing with life and death here. The most common way, or one of the most common ways that women present with heart disease is death. Again, to the question you just read. And the fact is that they come in with no symptoms, very little analysis of risk factors, and they come in dead on arrival is not okay. Okay, so what I would like to see, swinging for the fences in 3 years, is that every hospital in the country, again, big ask, has a women's heart health center, not a women's health center, because we've seen that movie. So I will, without mentioning names, started a women's health center that devolved into what Stacy mentioned, which is the bikini approach to women's health. So it started off great, and then the next thing you know, it was just skewed toward, maternal health, breast health, gynecologic health. Okay, so what I would love to see in 3 years, where I think we could make a great impact, is that every medical center has a women's heart health center. That's my ask.
Well, it sounds
Can I,
reasonable to me.
can I align with you? And
Yes.
only not give up the fight that Dr. Wenger taught us about decades ago, that to not accept the fact that the women's health devolves into the bikini approach,
Yep.
because we know that that's a tremendous lost opportunity and we cannot go backwards. That's a fight we all need to continue.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, my friend.
But
Appreciate that.
the importance of a women's heart health center is the message to women that their heart health matters.
Matters, right? Right.
That we can help. And again, we have to start putting out the information that the female heart is vulnerable. And we have ways to alter that vulnerability. And that vulnerability will affect women, will affect their families, will affect their children. So I'd like to see posters all across all of the travel areas. I'd like to see us use social media. This is the way to access the younger women. And we have to get our messages where the women are. And the message is the female heart is vulnerable and you can do something to alter and mitigate that vulnerability.
Nanette, I love what you said about the heart mattering, because the title of my book is literally Heart Matters. So I am going to send you a signed copy, my friend, and thank you for that. I totally agree with you.
Very good. And we had a program that we did for many, many years, and I'm about to revive it, which is a program that says, show your heart you care. And it was directed to women. We've copyrighted it, but everyone can have it. I have no problem with the copyright. But what it did is it outlined what you did about how the heart works.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize how their heart works. And then what you can do to keep that heart working and what you can do to keep it working well. Yeah. And this is a very simple self-help aid, and people are into self-help.
Mm-hmm.
Well, fantastic. I mean, all the information and the descriptives, and certainly thinking about how many times my heart beats and what it looks like in a tanker is, it's quite graphic. I appreciate that. The pandemic has taken taken a toll on most women and obviously exacerbated stress and trauma. Will that lead to more heart issues, in your opinion?
100%. We already are seeing this data, and I know Jennifer's on top of this as well with AHA, but we are going to see a tsunami of heart disease as a result of COVID-19, because many people think about COVID-19 as a respiratory virus. It is not, okay? It is a virus that is attacking the blood vessels in your body. We, on autopsy and in clinical studies, have shown that the SARS-CoV-2 virus is actually in your endothelium, which is the lining of all your blood vessels, which is why people with COVID-19 have an uptick or an increase in stroke, large hemispheric strokes, extremity malperfusion, meaning, people are losing limbs, COVID toes, and in addition, cardiovascular disease as well. And so I think the long-term repercussions of this are going to be horrific. And secondarily is the issue of obesity. So during the pandemic, 42% of Americans gained weight during the pandemic. And of that, the average weight gain was 29 pounds. with 1 in 5 people gaining about 50 pounds. Now, 72% of Americans are already overweight or obese. So you're adding these two things together. And again, I think this is a perfect storm of what's going to be a horrific, legendary development of cardiovascular disease, which is why, again, I'm pleased that we have WHAM and we have the American Heart Association to help us move forward.
Again, remember that this pandemic is unparalleled in contemporary
Right.
history, and we appropriately devoted attention to it and to COVID vaccination, et cetera, which is a part of cardiovascular care, preventive care. But what happened is we, for 2.5 years, neglected so many of the basics in terms of physical activity, eating healthy. A lot of people started smoking because they were at home. Certainly, they didn't get their routine evaluations, and they didn't do all of the care of the other conditions, and particularly the heart disease.
Right.
Patients were afraid to come to hospital because of COVID. And when we saw them with their heart attack 3 or 4 days later, we saw complications that I hadn't seen since I was a medical student, before we had the ability to revascularize the heart. We see patients who are having heart failure, who are not keeping their routine appointments, who are not having their medications titrated. All of the preventive interventions, the diabetes control, the cholesterol control, the blood pressure control, require not the giving of medications, but the titration of medications to endpoints. That didn't happen during COVID, but we did learn something. We learned that perhaps, because we did so much telemedicine, that perhaps we can use telemedicine for titration of chronic diseases. We now have so many wearables that will measure these and send them that we can probably avoid patients having to come to office visits, titrate medicines, get patients to goal much more rapidly, and therefore have our preventive sphere be much more easily accomplished.
And, Nanette, what's fascinating about your points is that women were hit harder during the COVID pandemic with work and multiple roles that women play in lives. But the opportunity to study and look at the different care models that we were acutely required to use when people weren't coming in is another wonderful opportunity, whether it's monitoring hypertension with wearables and other digital initially novel ways to manage care. I think I am optimistic could have a larger impact on women.
So are we at WHAM, which is one of the reasons that we invited Kathy, is to start inserting the idea that we will need much more innovation in all kinds of digital technology, wearables, devices, diagnostics. So that brings us really to why this campaign 3 Not 30 is so much of our call to action at this moment. And it's truly because we believe that collectively, and that's what we've been talking about, we have the economic power, we have the intellect, we have the financial means to create change. And we recognize that women drive economies. So like I said, in the US, we make up more than 50% of the workforce and 52% of the population. And we do control over 60% of the wealth, and we do make the consumer spending decisions, and we are the chief medical officers. So it seems to me, given the power that we also have the ability to create the change that we can set forth today so that women and society, because women affect their families, the family affects society, we can flourish, all of us, in 3 years and not wait another 30. So if you'd like more information about WHAM, obviously, please visit whamnow.org. It's WHAMNOW.org, or you can follow us on social media. But most importantly, I really want to thank my incredible friends on this panel who have brought so much into my life and have changed and enriched my life in so many ways. And I can't wait to continue this dialogue with you and to continue to see what kind of change we can make in 3 Not 30. Our next conversation will be on autoimmune disease, and we hope to see you then on March 9th. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll be in touch with you all. Have a wonderful day.